So, South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol is currently on his way back home after wrapping up his first overseas trip, attending the G7 summit over in Canada. To walk us through the key takeaways from his three-day visit, we have our presidential office correspondent Song Yoo-jin here in the studio. It's good to see you, Yoo-jin.
Great to be here, Dami.
So, Yoo-jin, the trip has come to an end, but wasn't there uncertainty at first over whether President Yi would attend the G7 summit at all?
You're right, Dami. There was definitely a lot of speculation and questions, especially because this particular trip came just 12 days after President Yi took office, marking the fastest overseas debut for any South Korean president. Now, for your comparison, it took President Yoon Suk Yeol, former President Yoon Suk Yeol, 49 days, Moon Jae-in 51 days, and Park Geun-hye 70 days. Now, despite this tight timeline, President Yi did make the decision to attend. So here's what he told reporters aboard the Air Force One.
국제사회에 대한민국이 신속하게 정상화됐다는 것을 좀 보여주는 게 필요하다라는 의견도 있었고, 또 앞으로는 우리가 국제사회가 협력할 분야가 상당히 많은데 좀 무리하더라도 일찍 정촉하는 게 낫겠다는 의견들이 많아서.
As you know, South Korea experienced a period of stalled diplomacy after former President Yoon's martial law debacle back in December.
Right. It was certainly a meaningful debut. Now, Yoo-jin, let's turn to the results. He did deliver remarks at the G7's expanded session, but much attention was on his bilateral meetings. So why don't we start with Tuesday's meeting with Japan?
Right, that was indeed the most anticipated one during President Yi's visit, especially after the planned summit with U.S. President Donald Trump was canceled because, as you know, President Trump decided to return early, citing the situation in the Middle East. However, President Yi did meet with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, marking their very first summit.
우리나라에서는 일본과 한국과의 관계를 가깝고도 먼 나라라고 호칭합니다. 마치 앞마당을 같이 쓰는 이웃집처럼 우리는 뗄래야 뗄 수 없는 것. 오늘을 계기로 한국과 일본이 미래지향적으로 좀 더 나은 관계로 발전하기를 진심으로 기대합니다.
I truly hope that marking the 60th anniversary of normalized diplomatic ties, exchanges will grow not just between our two governments and businesses, but also between our people. I look forward to Korea and Japan working together in a way that contributes more to the region and to the world.
So during this 30-minute meeting, the leaders reaffirmed their commitment to regular summit-level meetings while also agreeing to strengthening trilateral coordination with the United States, particularly in responding to regional geopolitical challenges, including North Korea. A senior presidential office official told reporters the talks were held in a positive, friendly atmosphere, and both leaders expressed interest in frequent reciprocal visits.
Now, aside from Japan, with Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba on Tuesday, President Yi also made sure to sit down with other world leaders, right?
Right. So on Tuesday alone, President Yi held bilateral meetings with 6 other heads of state, plus UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Now, among the G7 members, he met with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
The leaders of South Korea and the UK agreed to move forward on updating their post-Brexit FTA. They also discussed working together on Korean Peninsula, peace and security.
And in his summit with Canadian Prime Minister Carney, he emphasized defense cooperation, specifically mentioning the participation of Korean companies in Canada's submarine acquisition program, with contracts expected to be finalized by 2028. President Yi also held summits with the leaders of Brazil, Mexico, India, and the European Union, where economic cooperation was high on the agenda.
But Yoo-jin, President Yoon Suk Yeol's summit diplomacy actually began on Monday on the first of the three-day visit, right?
Right. So President Yi actually kicked off his visit to Canada by holding a bilateral meeting with 2 world leaders. First, the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, which also focused on economic and security cooperation. Now, throughout his bilateral meetings with a total of 9 heads of state, the presidential office says that President Yi prioritized building personal rapport and also pragmatic diplomacy.
President Lee engaged comfortably with all the leaders, drawing on his prior knowledge of their personal backgrounds, political careers, and governing philosophies, while also using his trademark humor to build rapport.
In virtually every bilateral meeting, there were focused discussions on advancing practical cooperation in areas like trade, investment, supply chains, and energy, aimed at delivering real benefits for the Korean economy and businesses.
Well, it certainly does seem like a strong start, but there's still a pending task left, a meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. Yoo-jin, any updates on when that could happen?
Well, that is, as of now, the big question, because a lot of people put focus on whether President Lee would meet President Donald Trump, because the looming deadline for the 25% reciprocal tariffs by the Trump administration on South Korea is approaching fast. However, the talks apparently, as you know, did not realize. So according to a senior top office official, talks are currently ongoing to arrange a meeting at another multilateral engagement. One possibility is next week's NATO summit, but President Lee's attendance hasn't been confirmed yet.
Well, Yoo-jin, we're going to have to get back to you once that happens in the near future. Thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.